Hey. Sure. Anything? Okay. Hi. It hasn't, we're getting the AV set up, so. You missed it. Is Gloria going to do an intro, or? She went to get something, because you guys were setting up, so. It's Canton. Canton. Right. Yeah, it said the same as Ohio. Being from Ohio, that's the first place I think of. It's not where I work. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm from Swanton, Ohio, which is Toledo Express Airport. I grew up behind the airport, watching Blue Angels practice, and it wasn't such a bad thing. I can just do the intro. Okay. Thank you. No problem. So it's nice to see I accidentally wore the right colors today. I'm actually Ohio displaced persons. I'm from, as I just said, Swanton, Ohio, Toledo area. And I moved to Detroit 27 years ago now to go to graduate school at Wayne State Med. I've done a little bit of everything. I did 10 years of basic research, 4.5 years of epidemiology, 2.5 years of clinical research, 9 years at the FDA, and now I'm a regulatory compliance manager for MMS, which stands for Managed Medical Solutions, if anyone's wondering. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a pretty quick overview of what medical research looks like in the clinic. I'm not going to go through all the basic research and everything that leads up to it. And then what agencies are involved in regulation. Let me see if it'll advance. What regulatory requirements there are. There are a lot, so we're not going to talk about all of them, but I will show you the massive number of them on a slide. Introduce you to the common research entities you come across in clinical research, and then talk about a few of our courses that we're offering here at MMS, through Findlay at MMS. Okay. So I don't know how familiar everybody is with basic research or animal research, but I think most of us know that everything starts in the laboratory. And 10 to 50 years of research go into everything that you do. In cancer biology, I started out looking at metastasis as something that my direct investigator had looked at her entire life, and 30 years in, they were finally finding some solutions to metastasis and preventing it. This is primarily at government institutions and universities. It is usually publicly funded. NIH is something that you're probably all more than aware of, is the funding agency primarily, but there are a lot of small grants given out by Komen Foundation, Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, and places like that. As I said, the time frame is infinite. These studies can last decades. Once there's a promising target for a drug or even a device, things go into animal research phase. These are a combination of public and private entities usually. The public entities are still usually universities. but the pharmaceutical firms, for something very promising, will usually buy the technology or buy the rights to the discovery from the public institution, and they will complete the research through an animal research facility or pay the university to complete the research through animals. Usually, on average, it's about 3.5 years from the time that you discover a target until we're through animals. And that leads us to where we're going today, which is the clinical research end. So it is a mostly private funding because most of the funding has been drawn back by the federal government from NIH to do this type of research. This is directly in humans. It starts with phase 1 studies and goes all the way through phase 4. Phase 1 is first in human. You're looking for safety. And I'm not sure how much everybody's learned about this in pharmacy, but it should be a little bit. I'll look at the professors to get cues for this. Yeah. So you add more and more people. Phase 1 can be from anywhere from literally a handful of people, 5, 6 people, up to 80. They try to keep it less than 200. Phase 2 will be for, well, phase 1's toxicity, phase 2 is safety, phase 3 will be your pivotal study, so it will look at the effects and see if it's better than current or at least equal to current treatments. Pharmaceutical firms, as I said, fund this. The time frame is approximately 8.5 years to go from phase 1 to phase 3. Sometimes the federal government, when they put in an application, will reject that and make them go back and do more studies, so the time frame can be a lot longer. It all depends on how good the response times are. Okay. So these studies are built and provided to the regulatory authorities for approval before they're even started. Okay, that doesn't mean that the study is scientifically sound. That doesn't mean that it will work, but that does mean the regulatory authorities have given you approval to go ahead and do the study. They have to do this because it's actually illegal to put a vehicle in interstate commerce that has not yet been approved for use. So this gives you that legal loophole. So what are those regulatory authorities? I'm going to go quickly through what they are. We deal primarily with 3 different types of authorities. We deal with the European Medicines Agency. That is the agency in the EU that coordinates all of the country-specific agencies. It is not the FDA for the European Union. It does not have the power to cite you like a local authority would, but they do inspections, they do approvals. If the EMA approves something, all member states have agreed that it is approved in their country. Okay, so they're a coordinating centralized body. They monitor the safety of an agent throughout its lifetime, so that's throughout the studies all the way until after it's marketed. We still make sure it's safe because as you should know, or you will learn, these studies are actually focused on a small group of people. The groups get bigger and bigger with every phase. Very small group to start with for toxicity, larger group for safety, larger group yet with several hundred people for efficacy. Once it's been proved safe and effective, it's approved for marketing, but you still have to monitor it. And that's because these groups are very selected. Everybody in the studies is as alike as possible. There are eligibility requirements for them to make sure that they are. Otherwise, we would not be able to draw good scientific conclusions from them because there'd be too much variability between the people. So when you market it to a very large population, you suddenly get all this variability that can change the side effects that we expect, change the outcomes. So Aleve is something that's on the market now. People who are in their 40s and 50s should not take Aleve, but they didn't know that it would give heart problems to people who took it long term because they had tested it in the elderly, 70, 80 years, 90 years old. I know that elderly, I saw you roll your eyes a little bit. I'm close to that myself, but they tested in older populations, so they didn't know in younger populations you would have this long-term outcome. So these are the reasons they market it long-term throughout the lifetime. So they also ensure that there's lay information available for the public so that the public can understand how to use the drug, what side effects it will have. They actually are linked. All the parties in the EU are linked through UDRANET, which is an internet service. All studies have to be registered on UDRANET that are being done in the EU or by an EU firm. So I will come back to that again later. Their collections of rules and regulations are in something called UDRALEX. So that's just where you find their guidelines and all their rules. An example of the rules. So these are the relevant regulations, volumes 1, 2, 2A, 3, 4, 9, and 10. The ones in between are for animal and veterinary medicines or for devices. I just listed the volumes here. There are a lot of rules that go with this. They do not cover every rule for every country. These are the consolidated general rules that everyone has agreed will apply. So I won't go through them all, but if you look up UDRALEX, you will find them all and you can read them in all their wonderful legalese. The other entity we work with is the International Council on Harmonization. This is not a regulatory authority. This is a body, per se. It is a body that develops harmonized guidelines. It was started by Japan, the UK, and the US. We harmonized our rules for the regulation of medical products. And now it is a much larger group. We have many member countries, and we have the countries that are just observers that can't vote on the harmonized rules, but they do have input scientifically. So your member countries can vote on the harmonized rules. Once they vote on them, your member states are expected to adopt them, but they do not have to. The ICH was built to promote public health and prevent the duplication of clinical trials across multiple countries or across firms, industry. There are industrial members of the ICH that includes pharma from the United States. It's the Pharmaceutical Professional Organization. They focus on guidelines for efficacy, safety, quality. Multidisciplinary will cross all of those. The U.S. is a big driver of these regulations still, and you will see oftentimes we will have a regulation come out and several years later the ICH will adopt something similar. The maintenance of electronic records in healthcare was adopted by the U.S. more than 10 years ago. It became effective about 10 years ago, went into actual practice. The EU just adopted them within the last 5 years under ICH, because the EU and the EMA is part of the ICH. So they have implemented that rule. There are many countries that are observers that are not members who use these rules and guidelines to develop their own country's rules and regulations, because they're a good solid basis for how to manage trials, how to manage drugs after they've been marketed. The marketing process is also addressed. Okay. If anyone has any questions anytime, go ahead and ask. Okay. So there are over 60 guidelines. Okay, they cover everything from quality of the product in its manufacturing state to proving efficacy and safety, and in cross-cutting topics. So that could be anything from terminology and standards to safety studies in animals. It covers the whole gamut of basic to clinical research and post-marketing. So that's why they're good adoption. You will see, if you look up the FDA, you will see ICH guidelines under the FDA's guidance documents, because the United States does adopt these guidelines. They do not circumvent our own. They're in addition to our own, and they're seen as a best practice. They often mirror ours, like I said. So the biggest agency we deal with outside of the EMA is the US FDA. A lot of firms will either go to get a marketing approval from the FDA first and then the EMA, or the other way around, and then they go for all of the other little countries because they're the two biggest markets. The US FDA implements and enforces all the laws from the US federal government. The regulations that you see from the FDA are an interpretation of the law. Okay. The law is the FD&C Act. It was written in the early 1900s, huge revision in 1932, and it is interpreted in the Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 21. Okay. There are a lot of parts to Chapter 21. Those that focus on human research, Part 11 for electronic records, protection of human subjects has 50, 54, and 56. It also, if you go down the bottom, has 45 CFR Part 46. That's not an FDA requirement. That is an NIH requirement, but I threw it in because we don't want to leave that one out. All of the human research subjects regulations are based on the Declaration of Helsinki and the Belmont Report that came out after World War II. And they're revised whenever something bad happens, like the syphilis studies in Tuskegee, anything similar to that. Then in the 2 and 358 is good laboratory practice, so that's your animal studies. 200 and 300 are pharmaceutical manufacturing. Biological products, so stem cells, are covered in 600s, along with 211 for manufacturing. Medical devices are 800, we're not covering that. The other important ones, 1271 for cells and tissues, stem cells are partially covered under that, but they're also considered a drug. So they're only they're very manipulated, so they don't consider them a straight up cell or tissue. Those are blood, plasma. Okay, so 211 are the biggest ones for pharmaceuticals, and then we'll go to 312 and 314 are covered for, and they're not under there. The 300 series. So 312 and 314 cover the applications to get a study approved to start, and 314 is the application process to market. 312s give directions for who is responsible for what in a clinical study, the physicians, the pharmaceutical firms, and everybody else. Those references, since you'll have this, you'll be able to get this presentation if you want it, are all in here from the EMA, the FDA, the ICH, UDRILEX, UDRINET. Like the EMA, we do have a requirement that you register all clinical studies. So if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can find every clinical study that's being done in the US. Yes?
Between the EMA, FDA, and the EU, when is it appropriate to follow which guidelines? Is it depending on the country that the study is being done in?
It is dependent on the country you're doing it in and the intention of your submission. So if you're doing a study that you submit, that you're intending to market a drug in the US, but you're doing it in Hungary, you fall under the EU because they're an EU member, so you have to follow the EMA guidelines. You also have to follow FDA regulations because we do accept studies that don't follow FDA regulations. There are carve-outs because it's a foreign entity. For example, there's certain paperwork they don't have to file, but we still expect you to protect your human subjects' rights in particular. Okay, the marketing application and the application to start the research would purely be under FDA. The actual clinical conduct of the study, there are carve-outs. So that physician will probably just follow ICH and EMA. ICH is a best practice. EMA guidelines are based on it. Anything else? Okay, so the other entities that are involved, we're going to go through these fairly quickly. The pharmaceutical firms. I'll introduce contract research organizations, institutional review boards, what the clinical sites do in the central laboratories or central radiological facilities. Okay, pharmaceutical firms, as I noted earlier, they pay for and run most clinical studies. The clinical studies that you see run in institutions, such as your comprehensive cancer centers, are usually comparative studies. There are 2 existing approved agents, and they're comparing their efficacy to each other. Which one's better, which combinations are better. If you have, because I'm from a cancer background, I always use this as an example, but if you have a recurrence of a cancer and you want to go the next, what is our next available best option treatment, there might be a study to compare to next options. So those are the kinds of studies they do. There is NIH approved money for that. There's also private approved money. Pharmaceutical firms run most of the new drug studies. There's money in it if they can get it through the pipeline, if it works. They also are required to provide all the data to the regulatory authorities. Those would be their submissions. The animal studies are the basis for the submission to be approved for first-in-human studies. Has to be, the animal studies go through the same process as humans. Toxicity, so they know what the best dose is, the LD50. Then you go through safety, efficacy. So the last thing you'll see them do is have an animal model with the condition that they're studying. So knockout mice are important to this, tumor transplants are important to this, and they'll see if the drug actually worked. Those studies all have to be submitted to your regulatory authority to get approval to even start in human beings. Okay? They spend anywhere from $50 to $115 million on a study. That's because it takes 10 to 15 years to get to market. I will tell you, being from academics and through the FDA and now in pharmaceutical, CRO, a third to a half of that is spent in marketing. So that number is a bit misleading. But the studies are extremely expensive. The application to the FDA itself is over $2 million. So if you have like an application that's reliant on multiple studies, it can be millions and millions of dollars just to get the review. They normally hire a lot of CROs and outsource everything. These are contract research organizations. So they're contracted entities. They do everything from running the study to designing them, and that's where I'm going to go next here. Okay. So the CROs are usually multi-service. This is what MMS is. We are what you call a data CRO. We do not have sites. We do not provide monitors to oversee studies on a day-to-day basis at sites. We do not have investigational review boards, but we do all the data. We will hold the data. We will statistically analyze your data. We will do audits of your sites to make sure they're functioning properly. So that's what I do. I do the same thing I did for the FDA. I go out and inspect your site and I tell you what you're doing wrong and how to fix it. Hopefully you're doing that early so that you can fix it before it's a problem, but that's usually not the case. We do a lot of running around trying to get everyone to get everything correct before the applications go in. We also write for them. So we write their studies. We write their IND applications with those animal studies. We write their NDA applications for marketing approvals. We write their protocols. We write their consent forms. Everything that goes into a study, we will write for you. And we will publish it to the regulatory agency for you. So we'll send it in. The NDAs, the new drug applications, are the marketing applications under the EMA. They're the same thing. They can be 500,000 pages long. So these take teams of people to do. The last thing that happens is everything within that is quality controlled, is cross-referenced, is checked for typographical errors. We have teams that just do this. The medical writers have all the information, they put it together so it makes sense, and then it goes through a quality process. We also have regulatory advisors that will hold the hand of the pharmaceutical company and help them get through FDA or EMA meetings, because they'll invite you to a meeting if your drug is being considered for approval, and you have to defend it. Defend those studies. Give them an overview of what happened, why this is scientifically important, why it's valid, why it's needed. You can invite the public to address the FDA at these meetings. Most often people do, particularly for orphan drugs, because orphan drugs are made for very, very vulnerable populations. So their testimonies are particularly effective when there is nothing else out there. Okay. We often see them for very vulnerable populations, such as pregnancies, very young people as well. We also do disclosures. Those are the filings of what study is going on, what stage it's in, what sites are participating in that UDRACT and at clinicaltrials.gov. So we manage all the stuff behind the scenes. Okay. So those are the people who are running the studies. You know, the regulatory authorities have oversight. They've given some of that oversight to what's called an institutional review board, or an IRB, or an independent ethics committee. In the US, they're institutional review boards. They're sometimes called human investigation committees, but they're all the same thing. In Europe, they're ethics committees or independent ethics committees. They are your day-to-day group that is responsible for making sure your human rights are protected. Okay. They are the FDA's answer to not being able to be there all the time. They review the protocols to make sure that they're adequate. They explain everything that can be followed. They review consent forms to make sure they follow the protocol. They're explanatory. They contain all the information that the subject should have. Okay? So they're protecting that person from being involved in a study that is unethical or being coerced to be in that study. They also oversee the day-to-day safety. So if you have somebody who has what we call an adverse event, that's anything from getting your hand cut with a knife to getting in a car accident completely unrelated to the study, to having a heart attack because the drug side effects are heart problems. Okay. They get those reports and they review them. And if there is a need to stop the study while it's going at that institution, it's their duty to stop it and report it to the regulatory authorities. The reports have to go into the regulatory authorities as well, but your IRBs are the front line. Okay. They are the only ones that go through those site-specific consent forms and make sure that they're adequate and accurate. If they don't do their job, there's a problem. I have reviewed for the FDA juvenile research studies. The consent form study purpose did not match the actual study purpose. And they gave the children who are between the ages of 10 and 14 often have to assent or agree to be in the study while the parent provides consent. Okay? They would give the children toys to participate. So it was coercive and it was erroneous. The IRB got an inspection after the site got an inspection because that's their job, is to make sure this isn't happening. And it was right in the application to the IRB that the children were getting toys. So that was their oversight. And they didn't compare the consent form to the protocol. So it was wrong. It said it would cure their lung problems. They thought this drug would cure them, when really it was just to see if it was effective at all. Okay. They also provide training to personnel on site, what is most commonly city training. It's CTTI. It's a clinical trials initiative. Everybody goes through it. It teaches you human rights protections, Declaration of Helsinki, Belmont Report, as I mentioned already. And they will have their own their processes on how to run a study locally. So your sites, which is our next entity, they have to follow several things. They have to follow your regulations, they have to follow the protocol, and they have to follow your ethics or IRB rules. Okay. For this reason, it is very important that the protocols be written well. Because if the protocol is poorly written and not done by a good medical writer, it's not going to be able to be followed. I've had multiple studies where the study calendar, which is an Excel spreadsheet document of what is supposed to happen when, does not match the protocol itself. And that is a problem because then the physician doesn't know what to do. And when you're an auditor, you don't know what they did and didn't do correctly. And when you're the statistician, you're getting data that's garbage. So you can't really use it. So a lot hinges on the tools that they have at hand. So the clarity of the documents, the investigator brochures, I think some of you should be familiar with. For a new drug that's being studied, this is all the known side effects, the prescribing information, the safety and toxicity information is all in these brochures that can be rather lengthy. It's very important that they be adequate and accurate because Besides the clinical physician, your pharmacist is your next line. Pharmacists are specifically trained to be in clinical research. The drug management is different, the documentation is different, and the oversight of the patients is different. You're much more involved. Okay, most pharmacies in research facilities that are institutions, such as academic institutions or hospitals, they have to separate their clinical research pharmacy from their regular pharmacy because of the control of the drug and the documentation and everything that goes with it. Okay. So they also have manuals that they have to follow for the collection of samples, how to send those in. When your lab manual's a mess, you're a mess. You know, I last year audited a study for a pharmaceutical firm. We couldn't figure out what was going on with their lab samples. They were late. They were hemolyzed. There were all kinds of things wrong. In France, they were getting manuals written in Russian. And the lab manuals had erroneous directions. The pictures didn't match the it just bad. Again, it comes down to the medical writers. Okay. That brings us to our central labs, actually. I didn't plan it, but it does. Most studies these days do use central facilities. And that's because laboratories, I don't know how familiar you are with clinical laboratories, but clinical labs all have different testing platforms. Many of them are automated. So there'll be machinery actually moving samples and doing all the testing and reading all the results automatically. Depending on the test you're using and the platform you're using, the ranges of normal are different. So if you go to a hospital in Findlay and have a lab draw, and you go to a hospital in Detroit and have a lab draw, the normal ranges are probably different. Okay. Clinical centralized laboratories relieve you of that problem. So if you're a statistician, everything's the same. You don't have to start figuring out whose normals are where and what the range is and manipulating the data. It also removes human error because you have the same group of people trained the same way doing the test every time. Okay? For the same reason, radiological facilities are becoming centralized, and it's particularly important with radiological because it can be very subjective, and pathology as well. But give you a brief FDA story. I had a site that the physician had done hip implants, and he read his own radiography. So he read his initial, the person needs a hip implant, this is how many degrees their hip is off, this is how degraded it is, did the implant. The firm came back and said, it looks like it's unstable because it's more than 3 degrees off in that radiology exam. He reread them all, and it was fine. Suddenly there was no movement. Centralized facilities remove the subjectiveness and remove any coercion from the equation. Okay. There's a lot of money in clinical sites. There's a lot of money in this for pharmaceutical firms. Don't underestimate the power of greed or need. Okay. So, as I've tried to stress here, medical writing is a key fundamental for all of this. When I was in graduate school, it's one of the things I actually considered doing, was being a medical journalist or a medical writer. We have a lot of PhDs and pharmacists who write for us. Pharmacists are particularly useful and helpful because they know how to write an investigator's brochure or a pharmacy manual. When you're doing a phase 3 study for a generic, there are a lot of generics out there for Humira, for example, right now. Every phase 3 study for that generic had to have a pharmacy brochure and an investigator's brochure. Investigators for the new drug, pharmacy for the known drug, Humira. Okay. The knowledge that a pharmacist brings to that is very, very important. Not many medical writers will have enough knowledge unless they're pharmacology PhDs. Okay, because you don't understand pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, LD50s. None of that do you understand. You can't write the toxicology well. Okay, and it slows down the process if you have a writer who can't write it so it can be interpreted by people in the clinic. Because then it has to go back through draft after draft after draft. And then the protocols, as I said, the applications. They also will help write journal articles, posters, whatever the pharmaceutical firm needs. Medical writers are involved in it every step of the way. Most of them work for CROs, such as MMS. Some pharmaceutical firms have their own medical writing group. If they have their own medical writing group, chances are they have partial contracts and partial in-house. Okay? There are a lot of jobs. People move jobs all the time because medical writing is such a big field. It's so important to have a good medical writer. I've not seen a medical writer with less than a master's. Okay, so you're an MS, PhD, or PharmD. So we offer 3 courses here at the University of Findlay. One is the fundamentals of medical writing, apparently not speaking because I can't say it. These are for clinical focused people. So if you don't want to be in a CVS behind the counter and you really want to be involved in the research end and directing that and regulatory focused, interpreting the regulations and bringing them into the protocol, making sure as you write this protocol, what you have to do is bring everything together. Previously published studies, previously published information, current study information, and all of the regulations that have to be followed. You have to have awareness of this. The pharmaceutical firms provide all of the resources. Internally at MMS, I provide the training and the resources for our medical writers for regulatory end, but they bring all that together to write all these documents. So you really have to be interested in human research to do this. As it says, motivated pharmaceutical science students who want to look at clinical development. Because pharmacists, I think, are very important to the process, but we don't have nearly enough. And then if you already are in the field, it's a good continued learning opportunity just to brush up on the basics and learn new skills and learn new expectations because the field is always evolving. Okay. So the fundamentals of medical writing is an 8-week course. They do give you templates, they give you information, and you have to write actual documents. So it's an interpretation of the current data from a study and in the regulations and being able to put that in a document just like you would be expected to do as a medical writer in the field. Okay. You get 2 clinical writing exercises. That's a protocol. Like I said, that is very, very key to the day in, day out of a study. And the clinical study report. The clinical study report is part of that new drug application. Okay. It is an interpretation of the studies that were run. And part of that application then is animal studies. And so there's just a lot of data that goes into it. But the clinical study report is a portion of that. And the personnel who review this and actually teach the course are from our medical writing department, and they're our managers. And they go through it and do quality assurance and quality control review just like we would for an actual product that we were putting out. Then we have NDA modules. This is your new drug or your marketing application. Okay, again, it's an 8-week course, and it's going to be a summary of individual data and a comparison analysis of integrated data as your exercises. Again, these are portions of that NDA. They go with the CSR. Okay, so if you take these together, you're really getting a full view of what goes into a new drug application. Okay, and we do a lot of these. They tend to go in cycles. So most pharmaceutical firms submit in December, January, April, and September for some reason. And as somebody who worked in the FDA, October and November were a nightmare because you had all of these new sites to go out and look at because somebody just submitted an NDA, and you tried to take a break over Christmas because come February you were swamped again. So they've always gone in cycles. Even when I was working in the clinic, that's just how it worked. I think they go with the fiscal years for the pharmaceutical firms. They want to get that NDA for that year. They might be, yeah. They're usually stressed out over Christmas because that January 30th deadline is usually the one they pick, and I have no idea why, honestly. The last one, Course 3, Clinical Trial Disclosures, is teaching you how to use that UDRANET and at clinicaltrials.gov and put data into that. You get all of the data on every subject in a study, and you have to narrow it down into just what is published. So you have to remove private information, and you have to be able to summarize the information from the clinical sites and concisely put it on to a public internet where there's, you're not going to put anybody at risk, and you're putting out an adequate and accurate, has to be an accurate picture of where the study is now, what phase it's in, how it's working, what sites are open, what sites are closed, what the accrual looks like, what their deadlines will look like. So that if somebody wants to find a clinical study for multiple sclerosis in Detroit, they can find the closest person, and they can see if they're accruing, and they can see what the study's about, so a summary of the protocol. They can see what's involved, what steps have to take. They can actually go through and see if they think they're eligible before they ever go there or call that person, and it provides them contact information. Okay, so there's a lot that goes into disclosures too. All right. So it is an accredited set of courses. So we have, with accreditation, you have to have adequate course design. Student registration processes have to be in place. The grading, you have to manage your complaints, manage your issues, just like the University of Findlay does. So on a much smaller scale. Okay. To apply to courses, the University of Findlay website has them all listed. If you just look up MMS is what I did, or you can look up MMS technical writing, and you can look into the courses. I will tell you that it's not a bad thing to have the writing capability because you don't know where your career will go. I wanted to be a teacher. I was an education minor for my undergrad. History, English, double major, education minor. I ended up being a biologist, cancer biologist. Never thought I'd do clinical research, much less work for the FDA, much less leave the FDA. So you don't know where you will go. And I have learned every step of the way, every bit of experience I've had has helped me in the next step. And writing, my ability to write, because I also was a journalism concentration, and I did a lot of journalism in high school and in college, has helped me tremendously. It gets you jobs, it helps you write reports. It doesn't have to be in this area. Being a good scientific writer makes all the difference. If you are just a pharmacist who wants to do research and never get in the clinical field, never be a medical writer, you will still want to be able to write publications or poster presentations for professional societies. These types of courses will help you do that. That's definitely a strength I've had that people have said, it is really good you have this. We don't see it very often, especially in an auditor. I can write my reports in half the time anybody else does. And I get really good feedback because I'm scientifically sound, which you will have because you're in these programs, and you are a sound writer because you've gotten proven feedback. So even if you don't want to go into medical writing, there's a little plug for you. I know it's helped me. Okay. And that's all I have. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Are each, the three courses you described are like is the first and second one like prerequisite for the third one? Do they have to be taken in order?
No, the first and second go in order, but they don't have to be done in order. You can take either one. Disclosures is a completely separate animal. It is a very unique field. One of the problems that we have as a CRO is finding someone who's ever done disclosures. It is a very small group of people in the United States who knows how to do them. So we fight for people who have experience, we train people who don't, and we fight to keep them. They're a hot commodity because it's hard to do, to be able to redact everything appropriately, to be able to summarize everything appropriately. The pharmaceutical clinical team, the pharmaceutical firm's clinical operations team will go through and make sure you have it right, but to have somebody who's good at it is really unique. Okay, so we have a core of 4 that do it. Some firms do their own, but we keep them very busy, because it's a unique field. And it's not something that It's not on a project, off a project. This is the lifetime of a study you're usually on it, or lifetime of a set of studies. Okay? Yes?
You know that CROs are big in India, most of the clinical research.
I'm sorry,
CROs, the contract research organizations,
Yes.
are big in India.
Oh yeah, I've been to India several times.
Many pharmacists work there. Are these courses available to Indian students or anybody else? They can go through University of India.
They can go through the University of Findlay, but I'll actually have to get back to you on the portals for that, because MMSU, which is what we call our offering, they're offered, but I think you do have to go through University of Findlay at this point. So definitely go through that portal and find out. But yeah, there are a lot of CROs in India, particularly generic firms for bioequivalence, bioanalytical. Yeah. I've been to several foreign countries as an auditor, India among them, and I have to say that their bioanalytical firms are pretty impressive for the, we call them BEQ studies for bioequivalence, but yeah, it would, we actually have offices in India too. A lot of companies and CROs do. So we're global. We have offices in the UK, South Africa, India, and Canton, Michigan, which isn't that far out of Detroit. So, yes.
These are online courses.
Yes.
Are they synchronous, asynchronous? What sort of support would the students get? Personal attention, all that stuff.
So they're all run by our managers in the medical writing and the disclosures field, so they can reach out to those managers at any time. So I'm not sure in terms of synchrony how they synchronize them, to be perfectly honest, because that's not something I looked into before I came down. Okay. But I know that the support is there. You get direct feedback, and if you have a question, there is somebody available. Okay. All right. If that's it, then thank you very much for your time and attention.